Good morning and welcome to Monday Morning Magazine. Actually, Dennis, John SAKOWICZ will be joining me as soon as we're able to get him on the line.
Wonderful.
And we are going to be your hosts for the next 2 hours of programming. We thank all of you for tuning in and joining us. Views and opinions expressed on today's program do not necessarily reflect those of the board, staff, and volunteers of KMUD Community Radio. We begin with the events unfolding in Afghanistan as the President Biden brings home all U.S. troops and American embassy personnel. Our first guest is veteran Marine Matthew Ho. Matthew Ho had nearly 12 years' experience in America's post-9/11 wars with the United States Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and State Department. He has been a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010. In 2009, Matthew resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, Matthew took part in the American occupation of Iraq, first in 2004 and 5 in Salah ad-Din province, with a State Department Reconstruction and Governance team, and then again in 2006 and 7 in Anbar province as a Marine Corps company commander. When not deployed, Matthew worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operation issues at the Pentagon and State Department from 2002 to 2008. This interview was pre-recorded. In this first segment, my guest is Matthew Ho. President Biden has originally marked September 11th as the full evacuation of all U.S. military and American embassy personnel out of Afghanistan. But given recent events, he's bumped that up to August 31st. The Taliban has claimed over two-thirds of the Afghan territory since U.S. troops began to draw down. And now, as of August 15th, the president of Afghanistan is gone. Could you just react to that?
Well, I think I've never seen anything like this in my life, and I think most people can say the same. The speed of this, how quickly things have developed in Afghanistan, the success of the Taliban military and political offensive just in the last 8 days is remarkable. But there is a lot of context to it. And I think if anyone is thinking that this happened just because Joe Biden took 2,500 troops out of a country the size of Texas, they really haven't thought about it very long. And just even today, and as this is occurring, we're understanding what is occurring. A senior Ghani, Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, a man who just left, a senior official in his government who is now working with the Taliban, explained in an interview today that this has been going on. These negotiations, this turnover, this success of the Taliban has been going on for months, if not years,
right,
as he put it. Right. So the idea that somehow this is just because the last U.S. troop left the other day. No, it is, yes, of course that was important. The Taliban wanted to wait for their final offensive until the Americans were out. That made strategic and operational success for them. They didn't want to give the Americans any reason to come back in. They didn't want to be seen as violating, right, any of the agreements that they had done with the United States. And then by waiting until. But then what you've seen, though, this collapse of the Afghan government, the Afghan military, the switching of allegiances. That was all. There's reasons for that that go back well beyond what simply this decision to remove troops. We built up a corrupt, predatory patronage network of a government and a military in Afghanistan, and this is the consequences of that. That as soon as the money stops going into it, or the threat of the money stops going into it, the idea the money may not come, well then, of course, the whole patronage network is going to collapse. And that's what we're seeing happen in Afghanistan. Basically, it's what happened in Iraq in 2014 as well.
Now, I've read reports that the deal that Mike Pompeo and Trump put into place back in February of 2020 did not include members of the Afghan government. In other words, it was made with the Taliban to be essentially allies. And this was a May 1st deadline by Trump. Is that true? Was this deal negotiated without the Afghan government present? Or do you know?
That's absolutely correct. And one of the real problems with that Doha agreement of February 2020 between the U.S. and the Taliban was not just the Afghan government wasn't included, because you could make the argument, okay, this is the first step or first phase of negotiations, right? And then it will move on to intra-Afghan negotiations. However, one of the main issues is that there was no transparency. There are actually secret annexes, because you can Google, look up the agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban, and it's quite short. It's only a few pages long. But, however, there are secret annexes to that agreement that the Afghan government themselves has never seen. So, I mean, the deals that were struck between the U.S. and the Taliban, even if they were above board, nothing really, they were kept from the Afghan government. So, as a colleague said the other day, the only thing that the United States has done worse than its occupation of Afghanistan is possibly this withdrawal from Afghanistan.
And President Biden holds out that we met our objectives years ago when Osama bin Laden was killed, of course, who orchestrated the 9/11 attacks, and that we were trying to defeat Al-Qaeda. Now, is that true? Those were the objectives? And if so, why have we stayed in this war so long, spending over $83 billion training and equipping Afghan security forces? And, within weeks, this is like all a wash.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that if that was the case, then after the United States killed Osama bin Laden in 2011 in Pakistan, which we should always bring up, in Pakistan, not Afghanistan, the United States kept its forces there and kept the war going and was heavily involved, and Joe Biden was the vice president then. A lot of people like to say that Joe Biden wanted us to get out of Afghanistan. That's not true. When Joe Biden was the vice president under Barack Obama, and Barack Obama escalated the war in Afghanistan. Barack Obama's escalation put in 100,000 more U.S. forces, plus 40,000 NATO forces, plus more than 100,000 contractors. So what you're talking about, really, under the Obama administration, the United States and NATO had a 250,000-man army in Afghanistan. But under Biden's plan that for the war, there would only have been 10,000 less American soldiers. So rather than there being, say, 250,000 U.S. and NATO troops and contractors, there would have been 240,000. So the idea that somehow Joe Biden was, he did at times seem to not agree with the war. He famously told Obama that you don't have to do with this, you don't have to do this in regards to escalating the war, although I think there's context lost on that. But to your point, though, Mary, about what was this about? The idea that somehow the United States was invaded Afghanistan, and I certainly understand the revenge aspects. I certainly understand the political pressures that George Bush was under. But, he lost whatever right intention Bush had by pursuing Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and punishing the Taliban for sheltering them, which itself, that whole idea that the Taliban were sheltering, is a very nuanced, complicated, not at all simple discussion. But, the idea that somehow going after an organization that had 400 people total at the time of 9/11, that's it. Al-Qaeda was 400 people strong at the time of 9/11. Wow. And this isn't what, Matthew Ho is saying. This is what the American FBI has said. And the idea that then you're going to invade a country and occupy it because of at most a 400-person terror group, I think most people would say, well, that's ridiculous. That's like taking the proverbial, sledgehammer out to try and kill the fly in your kitchen. What do you expect is going to happen? And, and the point being, to even everything we understood about Al-Qaeda and how they operated, the idea that, Afghanistan was basically the hotel that Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri, the number 2 in Al-Qaeda, who is still, 20 years later, who is still free. I mean, And I mean, that it was basically the hotel they were hiding out in. Meanwhile, with regards to 9/11, yes, so the hijackers, most of the hijackers did go to Afghanistan, but it seems primarily they went to Afghanistan to kiss the ring of bin Laden, basically. So bin Laden to get, right? I mean, but meanwhile, almost all the planning and training and logistics for the 9/11 attacks occurred in Pakistan, Germany, and then, of course, the most important training the hijackers received were in the American flight academies they attended.
In Florida, right?
The United States had hijackers in this country for 18 months prior to the attacks. So somehow that and then if you also look at the nature of the training, you're talking about, the hijackers and the Al-Qaeda people who planned this. They had meetings in Spain. They had meetings in Malaysia. They had meetings, it's believed, in either in possibly Qatar and the United Arab Emirates as well. You had the idea that you're going to put soldiers on the ground someplace and you're going to keep people from planning an attack that basically requires somebody's living room to plan it.
Right.
I mean, the whole idea is just so absurd, and that what's dangerous, though, Mary, is that people continue to hold on to this myth that a safe haven is needed. That if Taliban take back over Afghanistan, Al Qaeda will go back and they'll be able to plan another 9/11. And the reality is, they didn't need Afghanistan for it. The man who was in charge of all the logistics for the 9/11 attacks, all the logistics for it, the finances, buying plane tickets, getting passports, all that type of stuff. He never left Germany until a few days before the attacks. Right? I mean, so the idea again that we did this, not enough people in the United States are saying, wait, hang on, let's go back and examine the whole narrative behind this, the whole reason behind it. It was flawed. And then, of course, once we were there, and then, of course, I think the makeup of the Bush administration with the very heavy neoconservative presence among people in the National Security Council, in the State Department, and Department of Defense, et cetera. This was tailor-made for them to expand the empire, right? This falls completely in line with the idea that, the United States is fulfilling its destiny. These are people who are very much modern-day manifest destiny believers, that somehow the United States has a purpose in this world, and that is to spread its image abroad. Really, that's undergirded by, of course, American corporations, the defense industry, the military itself, the banks, et cetera. But there are these thinkers, and they predominated within the White House, within the Defense Pentagon, the State Department, et cetera, who had these ideas about how the United States should shape the world, basically. Not just maintain the American empire, but expand it. And that's who, of course, after that, you got the Iraq War and so on and so forth.
Well, I was reading in the Post, it said that this was like a 20-year experiment to remake a country, meaning the government, et cetera. And it's just too much to believe. I'm curious to know what you think about the Middle East further destabilizing in the event that the Taliban is now surging in Afghanistan, and why that matters to the United States. Why should we be paying attention?
I think if there's going to be any instability that's going to occur, it will occur as a result of a refugee crisis. Pakistan already has about 3 billion refugees. Iran has more than 1 million refugees. Both Pakistan and Iran have closed their borders to prevent any further refugees. So I think that is the main fear among people in the region, is that you're going to have this refugee crisis, or I should say an extension of the refugee crisis, because the Afghans for most of the last 4 decades, except at times when they were eclipsed by the Syrians, have been the largest refugee population in the world. I mean, this issue is, again, and I think, Mary, as we discuss this, everyone should always have kind of at the tip of their tongue, or on top of their head, the idea that this war didn't begin on 9/11. It begins back in the 1970s. that this war is a living legacy of the Cold War. That what we're seeing right now happen with the Taliban taking over the country is just the next chapter in this story. This horrible, tragic story of an unimaginable suffering of the Afghan people for the last 42 years at least, really longer than that probably. But, in terms of instability, at this point, it's done. The Taliban have won. The only way, and if the United States now has two choices. The United States can either be upset about it, be shamed by it, be humiliated by it, which in many ways we should be humiliated by our actions there for the last 40 years, really.
Right.
Or we can actually work in a way that might bring about some degree of improvement for Afghans. With the Taliban takeover, we are most likely going to see a reduction in violence, a significant reduction in violence, and that will bring about a very cruel and unjust peace, but at least it will be a peace. And people will no longer be worried that their children are going to be killed by a roadside bomb or by a bomb dropped from the sky. And if you have peace, if you have those ceasefires, if you have people, the cycle of violence coming to an end, then you have possibility for progress. Then you have the opportunity for development. Whatever progress or development people cherry pick over the last 20 years, and most of it is false and hollow. It has always been undone by the cycle of violence. So by ending that cycle of violence, maybe now, although it's a cruel and unjust peace, maybe now there is an opportunity for progress or some form of improvement in the lives of tens of millions of Afghans.
I wanted to conclude with your outspokenness and criticism of the United States government perpetual war mentality. You worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and the State Department. Just personally, react to that perpetual war mentality, and has U.S. war policy changed significantly since you resigned under protest?
Let me answer the last one. The second question first.
Okay.
Absolutely, it has changed fundamentally and in a way that is very important, I think, for the American public to understand. The United States, over the last decade, has shifted its war-making in the Muslim world. And basically, you're talking about war-making that goes from the west coast of Africa all the way to Pakistan. And in those countries, and Nick Terse, the journalist Nick Terse, has done some really good work on this. The Cost of War Project at Brown University has done some really good work on this. You're talking about the United States having combat troops being involved in combat, killing and being killed in at least 15 countries since 9/11, all of them in the Muslim world, right? And so we have these wars, and what's happened is you've had a transition from overt warfare, right? Sending in soldiers and Marines into Afghanistan, sending in same thing into a 150,000-man invasion force into Iraq, even to a case of Libya, piling a bunch of aircraft carriers off the coast and then dropping tens of thousands of pounds of bombs on the Libyans, things like that, to one that is very covert, one that is very secret. These wars are, and now Afghanistan is joining that fold. It'll be interesting to see what the United States will do. As the CIA is in charge of the war now in Afghanistan, basically, along with the Special Operations community, and their allegiance is really to the warlords, most of whom who are now joining the Taliban. So it'll be interesting to see what the United States, in terms of CIA and Special Operations activity, chooses to do, since the people that they are most established with are now aligning themselves or striking deals with the Taliban. But what you have, basically a covert secret war, right, that's occurring all throughout these countries, where it is being conducted by American CIA personnel, American Special Operations personnel, and increasingly by drones. All of those things are classified activities. By law, they are covert, and So the United States government has no obligation to lie about them because the United States government actually has a legal obligation not to talk about them. Right. And with that, you also back that with contractors, right? So you have a lot of contractors doing the work. And again, that same thing too. That is, you file a Freedom of Information Act request about a certain logistics company or private security company doing work on behalf of the United States government. You're not going to get anything. So there's a degree of hiding things through contractors that is simply valuable to those who want to wage these forms of war. And then most of the war is conducted through proxy forces, right? So using using whether they're government forces, whether they're militias, whether, and because most of the United States strategy in many of these countries predicates itself on a divide and conquer strategy. So, and that's why you see these wars getting worse. That's why you can take, Africa. The United States stands up its Africa Command in 2008. In 2008, there were 300 terror attacks all across Africa. 12 years later, after AFRICOM has been around for 12 years now, right? So you'd expect to see some difference in Africa in terms of terrorism, and we do see a difference. 12 years after AFRICOM has stood up, terror attacks in Africa go from 300 a year to almost 5,000. And the real reason why is because through a divide and conquer strategy, by backing up these corrupt and predatory governments, by putting the United States weapons and money behind illegitimate militias, these brutal militias, often you are forcing people to side with insurgencies just in order to survive and protect themselves. And so that's the way of American warfare. What that then does is that allows for the Army to focus on Europe, right? Because you need Russia in order to justify having tank divisions. Look, in the last year, the United States Army added 2 brigades of tanks.
How many is that? What's a brigade?
A brigade is roughly about 3,500, 3,500 or 4,000 soldiers. You're talking hundreds of tanks and other armored vehicles, right? Because without Russia, you can't justify that. The same in the Pacific. The Air Force wants these new B-21 bomber planes. They cost $500 million each for one plane, right? Yeah. And the Navy, our new aircraft carriers cost at least $13 billion. That's what they cost now, so imagine what they're going to cost in 5 years. The new submarines cost $10 billion. You can't justify that $500 million airplane, that $13 billion boat, without China. So, in a really crazy way, in a way that I don't think most people are not appreciating, the entire Pentagon is getting out of Afghanistan what they want. Special operations and CIA people get to run their dirty secret wars all throughout the Muslim world with nobody looking over their shoulder. The Army gets to fight its tank war against Russia. God forbid that happens. And, of course, the Air Force and Navy get to have all their planes and boats that they need to fight China. Again, God forbid that happens.
Matthew, we are out of time, but we do want you to come back. And, obviously, this isn't done yet. This is a time that was chosen to end this perpetual war, but who knows? It sounds like it's not going to be ended. Matthew Ho, I want to thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate the work you guys do.
You bet. Bye now.
Bye.
That was our first guest this morning in a pre-recorded interview, veteran Marine Matthew Ho. Matthew Ho had nearly 12 years' experience in America's post-9/11 wars with the United States Marine Corps, Department of Defense, and State Department. And what's interesting about him is he resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war.
Matt's a friend of our program, Heroes and Patriots. He's a friend of KMUD, KMUD. When I did a flash fund drive for KMUD on my birthday, June the 3rd, Matthew Ho was one of my 5,000 Facebook friends that ponied up some money. So Matt Ho is a friend of this station, KMUD. And again, I call out to our listening audience, if Matt Ho can support this program and can support this station, so can our listening audience. Matt Ho is a 100% disabled Marine Corps veteran in Afghanistan. He was a company commander in the Anbar province. He worked at the Pentagon and the State Department, and his writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, you name it. He's been a guest everywhere, CBS, CNN, Fox, NBC, MSNBC, NPR, PBS, you name it. And when he resigned from his post at the State Department and with the Marine Corps, the Council on Foreign Relations cited his resignation letter as an essential document. Matt is a friend of our program. He is a friend of the station, and I call upon every one of our listeners to support the work he's doing and to support the work we're doing in bringing him to this station.
It's 28 minutes past the hour, John, and we're going to bring in a guest now for a live interview. We're going to continue our discussion of the events in Afghanistan with another veteran who served in the Middle East, Danny Sjursen. Danny A. Sjursen is a retired U.S. Army officer, contributing editor of antiwar.com, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and director of the Eisenhower Media Network. His work has appeared in the New York Times, LA Times, The Nation, HuffPost, and many others. Danny served combat tours in both Iraq and Afghanistan and later taught history at West Point. He is the author of a memoir, Critical Analysis of the Iraq War, Ghostwriters of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge, and Patriotic Dissent, America in the Age of Endless War, something that we've just been talking about with Matt. Danny Sjursen, if you're with us, welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
If you could just speak up just a little bit more, Danny, than we can all hear. We're all on telephones today, so it gets to be a little tricky.
Yeah. Excuse me, no problem at all.
Danny, let me begin. You're a vet. You're a combat vet. You're a decorated combat vet. What are your personal feelings today, turning on CNN and just watching the chaotic evacuation at the Kabul airport? What are your reflections?
There's really twofold. First of all, there's just a tragedy to it. And, of course, that tragedy is an Afghan tragedy, right? The Afghan people who are really the victims of American hubris. But it's hard on a personal level not to be physically affected by the scenes. And the question that is raised for myself, I think for a lot of veterans, I probably got about 30 texts or calls yesterday from fellow vets of our tours in Afghanistan. And the real question that runs around is, what was it all for? This sense of fatalism, of waste, of absurdity. And while I've opposed the war in Afghanistan for some time as hopeless and, ill-advised, nevertheless, there's something jarring about watching the collapse and the speed of it. I don't want to be right about this, and so there's that element of it. And then on the other side, there is just this little bit of a tinge of feeling that this war, the American role in this war needed to end. And this is messy. And it was always going to be. This is worse than I think I even expected in terms of scope and scale and speed. However, what I'm not appreciating is the consensus from most of the establishment that, this is just a Biden foul, just this. I think that this is a shared, collective American failure that deserves a lot of soul-searching in a broader sense.
Who's going to get fired? What heads are going to roll?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, maybe nobody. That's it was in the military. There's not a whole lot of accountability at the top. Is this a military failure? Certainly Joe Biden's not going to resign. I would say that, perhaps someone at the mid-range or the upper mid-range. But, I mean, who would we even blame for this specifically? Who should be fired is almost all the analysts on CNN and MSNBC who do national security analysis, almost every columnist. Max Boot should get fired. I know that. David Ignatius. Everybody who's been telling us that more force, more money, more blood money, right, wasted, more bodies, more bombs, more drones. Everyone who's told us that, just a little bit more coin, a little bit more counterinsurgency, a little bit better tactics. That's hubris on a scale that tilts towards insanity. But I don't think there'll be any real accountability. And the fact that there won't be any real accountability means this could happen again. And so we've got people like Joe Biden saying, no, there are no parallels to Vietnam when he was asked in his announcement, in his press conference. None whatsoever, he said. Well, the very fact that we didn't learn about the limits of American military force to transform foreign societies, the fact that we didn't learn that last time is part of the reason it was able to happen again, because there was no real accountability. And I fear we're signing up for that again.
We were in touch with Michael Moore last night, and he's got some wonderful posts on his Twitter feed and what have you. And he's firing on all cylinders right now. But, he points out that today or yesterday was VJ Day, Victory Over Japan Day, August 15th, 1945. And, in fact, Michael Moore lost his uncle Lorne. A Japanese sniper took him out. And here, 76 years later, the U.S. lost the Afghanistan war. We were defeated by an army with no bomber planes, no destroyers, no missiles, no helicopters, no napalms, just a bunch of guys in pickup trucks. How did this happen?
Well, one of the ways it happened is that we lied to ourselves within the military and within the political structure, and we lied to the American people. Self-delusion is sometimes the worst of all, because you begin to believe the lies that are self-serving for your political or your economic benefit until you've crafted a web of delusion that makes it possible to say that we were always ready to turn a corner. We were always making progress against the Taliban in the face of evidence from insiders on the ground, even at fairly high levels, like ambassadorial levels, who had been saying, and the Afghanistan papers from the Washington Post actually demonstrate this quite clearly, but it was obvious before that. I really think that how this happened is, one, underestimating the level of popularity, and despite their brutality, the level of popularity of the Taliban, the level to which our military occupation handed the narrative to them, allowed them to sell themselves as the resistance, the true Afghans, unlike those lackeys in Kabul. True or not, right, or complicated or not, we handed that narrative to them. The second thing I think that happened was our inability to understand the limitations of force, the limited utility of force in foreign societies. And that is all about a delusion, too, because if you ask any historian, and they exist, right, they just don't go on TV a lot because, they're geeks, right? And no one cares what they think, and they don't have a whole lot of money. But there were 5, 6, 7 American scholars who studied Afghanistan. This is what they did. They would have laughed if you said, well, no, what we'll do is we'll send an American army, we'll occupy the place, and then there'll be a democracy. I mean, anyone who even studies military history would say landlocked country with a safe haven of porous borders and a safe haven supported by an intelligence service in Pakistan, massive dispersed population, big country, mountains, 5 major ethnic groups, ethno-linguistic groups, 2 different religions, and a history of defeating the top empire of the day with no exception. And America looked at that and said, in the delusion that is American exceptionalism, we looked in the face of that and said, no, it'll be different this time. I think how this happened is we lied to ourselves, we lied to the American people, and we did it for 20 years. And the chips got called. The check bounced. And it was always
right.
To.
I once had a psychotherapist who said, the cruelest delusion is self-delusion. The cruelest delusion is self-delusion. And it seems that we've done this as a country in Afghanistan and, in fact, in Iraq as well. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the chips will be called in a different way. It's a different situation in Iraq and Syria. Those will fall apart. Those will be exposed as they've been exposed as other types of that same self-delusion. But I would completely agree. This is a collective failure. I wish we could point to Don Rumsfeld or a Robert McNamara or a Donald Trump and say it was him, this guy, or Joe Biden. That would be easier if there were an evil puppet master who was utterly incompetent and nefarious, pulling the strings and purposely pulling the wrong ones, or just so dumb and just so ineffective, if there were a single point of failure, you could fix that and move on. But we have to take a hard look collectively at who we are and what role as Americans we think, A, we should play in the role, and B, we're capable and have the capacity to play in the world. And that requires a humility that hegemonic peoples and nations are not really known for.
Right. It's 37 minutes past the hour. We have about 8 more minutes with you, Danny. I want to encourage listeners to, call in 707-923-3911. If you have a question about this topic and the events going on in the Middle East, please give us a call. We like to invite all of our listeners to participate. Everyone is blaming Biden, but he wasn't involved in the February 2020 peace deal between Trump, Pompeo, and the Taliban. The government wasn't even involved. I find it interesting, and this 20-year war has occurred over 4 presidencies. Could you react to the fact that the Afghan government was excluded from this peace deal?
That is one of the most vital elements of this collapse, I think, is that, the Afghan government was never either, the legitimate kind of the partner with legitimacy that we hoped. There's massive corruption. It was seen as illegitimate by many Afghans. But also, we never really cared all that much, whether it was the Trump administration or even the late Obama administration, certainly to a large extent the Biden administration. We didn't care a whole lot about that government. We were done. We were beat. We couldn't say it. We had to say other things. But the reality was, for political reasons and just for hopelessness reasons, there was going to be a drawdown and a pullout. The Afghan government had they just really didn't want to make peace. We saw them, just like the South Vietnamese government in Saigon, we saw them as a block to peace. And in some ways they were, but it's really hard to negotiate peace when you're holding the weak hand. And not just the weak hand, but the weakest hand you've ever had in a 20 years worth of war. And so when the Afghan government was intransigent at any level, and out of just, what was seen as necessity or opportunism, or just we've got to get this done, Trump wanted a peace deal on the way out the door, even though he escalated before that, right? But now he's going to be the anti-war president. That might play well in November, right? All these things. The Afghan government was a block, so what we do? We did an end run. We did, we excluded them from the deal. And so when Kabul falls and the Afghan government falls, they weren't even really party to the deal. The deal just said America's going to leave, and here's some details about that, kind of maybe sort of and vague. And it speaks to the failure of propping up the legitimacy of this government. And it speaks to the limits of even being able to do that as a foreign invader, occupier at the tip of the bayonet. And I think that's a tragedy, and I really hope we learn something from that, because that looks remarkably similar to the way the South Vietnamese were seen as a bloc to the peace talks in Paris, and Nixon tried to fiddle with that and try to tell them to hold out for a better deal. So it's a lot of the same stuff. I think it's a key element. It's rarely mentioned. I'm really glad you brought it up.
Danny, I was talking to a retired CIA officer over the weekend. In fact, he was a station chief in one of the cities in Afghanistan. I wouldn't mention which one because he didn't give me permission to use his name. But I asked him what his reaction was, and he said 2 things. He says, think Pakistan, and he said, and think heroin and opium trade. The opium trade is going to surge now. It's going to fund new terrorism, and it's going to happen on the Afghan-Pakistan border. Just look for this to just blow up. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think that's a real possibility that there'll be an increase in, the heroin trade. But the problem is there's already been a 32 times increase in the hectares of land used to grow opium in Afghanistan in the last 17 years. And it's already exploding. We never managed. That was one of the most farcical elements of our war, was the war on drugs, Afghan edition, was always a farce. And we threw billions of dollars at it, and the outcomes was literally counterproductive. It didn't work. In other words, it actually increased. I wouldn't be surprised if that jumps again, but it's already happening. That the heroin trade is already fueling the Taliban and any of the associated groups that they may or may not, depending on the extent, be connected to. And I think to some extent they are, although it's often exaggerated. But I just don't know what the alternative is. The alternative meaning, to what extent could the United States meaningfully alter that outside of limited counterterror when there's genuine threats to the homeland? Not a lot of other countries have such insecurity, such profound insecurity in their psyche, collective psyche, that 10,000-mile away countries, are seen as somehow vital to our security. I think we have to be really honest with ourselves that we don't have the capacity or the will, not in terms of putting a million more people in uniform and sending them away for years at a time, like led to VJ Day. We have to admit we don't have the capacity or the will to stop there being a massive heroin trade and safe havens between Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Michael Moore mentioned that last night, that collective insecurity that we have as Americans, in spending over $2 trillion in Afghanistan and sacrificing 2,300, 2,400 American lives and countless more wounded in action, to invade a country where bin Laden was never found. He was nowhere to be found. Bush said he had no interest in capturing him. Obama's team found him in a house down the road from Pakistan's West Point. Who would have guessed?
Right.
We are enormously insecure as Americans, and it will be our downfall.
We have about a minute left with Danny. Danny, can you let our listeners know how they can follow you and read some of your articles, and also mention your books? You have, I think, at least 3 now. Would you do that in the minute we have left?
Yeah, absolutely. So skepticalvet.com has, all my writings end up there. I'm on Twitter at skepticalvet. I direct the Eisenhower Media Network, Eisenhower Media Network, all one word, .org, which has my work and bios, but also the other 12 fellows who are, combat veterans, longtime career people who are skeptical of American foreign policy and have independent, critical views. And then my latest book, you mentioned the first 2, is A True History of the United States, and that is available everywhere, but Steerforth Press is the home spot if you don't want to go to Amazon. And I'm just glad we got to talk about this. These are tough topics, emotional ones, and I just want to emphasize one last time, this is a jarring thing for my friends and the families of my soldiers who are dead, wounded, or alive and struggling, and I'm just glad we're talking about it.
Thank you so much, Danny, for joining us. John, did you have anything else on this?
Just today, I'm almost in tears. I think of all the Gold Star families. I think of those 2,400 mothers and fathers and wives. I'm just crushed by how swift this defeat was, and how sad it was, and how needless it was. Danny, my brother, thank you so much for serving. Thank you so much for continuing to serve on this program and in all the other venues in which you speak truth to power. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, and it's just a pleasure.